Obviously, there's still more things to be worked out for the remaining teams, but has the dust started to settle? Like, is there any sense of even closure after what happened in college football last week?
Well, as we record this, the Cal Board of Regents is about to go into a meeting to talk about something. I mean, they've got to do something. The Cal, Stanford, Oregon State, Washington State have to figure something out, and they have to figure it out very soon. So we'll see what happens. I mean, the ACC has met about this stuff. The ACC has met about helping the Pac-12 out since USC and UCLA left. I don't see that happening just logistically. I can't imagine that the ACC would pick up Cal and Stanford, even though most university presidents, you ask them, hey, you want to rub shoulders with Cal and Stanford? They're like, yeah. But most TV networks would say, nah, you can pass on that because they're not going to bring the amount of value that will keep the rest of your members from taking a haircut. So, and especially in the ACC where they have their own issues in terms of revenue sharing and distribution, it's hard to imagine that. So something needs to happen there. I would like the most logical thing is the Mountain West takes those four but maybe they use the Pac-12 name and branding, but the Mountain West runs it. That would be the most logical conclusion. But I think if you look at how everything that's happened over the past 2 years, logic is sort of out the window.
Yeah. So I'm admittedly not a huge college football fan, certainly not a college football expert, just to like put that out there. So if any of my questions wind up being inane, it comes from
I wouldn't worry about that.
Ignorance.
Well, but that's the thing, like trying to explain this to people who live normal lives and aren't knee deep in this stuff all the time. And that's where you realize like why they lose Supreme Court cases 9-0 and sort of, it's so weird. It's such a weird world, and everybody who's in it understands the language and all the quirks of it. But if you try to explain it to a normal person, like, what the hell are you talking about?
So for me, last week and Friday, it was like you hear Oregon and Washington are talking to the Big Ten, and then hours later the deal is done, which that struck me as odd. First of all, it strikes me as odd that Oregon and Washington are in the Big Ten, and then second, how did this happen so quickly? Did it happen that quickly? Are these deals something that can materialize in hours, or have they been discussed for weeks and months and we just didn't really hear about it?
Oh, it didn't happen quickly. I mean, Oregon and Washington reached out to the Big Ten as soon as they took USC and UCLA. And that was over a year ago. And they were trying to make their pitch for membership. And you heard the reporting that the Big Ten had already vetted Oregon and Washington. They had. When they looked at USC and UCLA, they also looked at potentially adding Oregon and Washington. After adding USC and UCLA, Oregon and Washington wanted to go to the Big Ten because they realized that the Pac-12 is pretty unstable. So they were, they had their people talking to the Big Ten people saying, hey, here's what we can offer. Here's what we do. Here's how we can help you. And so that was all there. But the Big Ten was in the position of, and it's hard to say how true any of this is, but the Big Ten presidents didn't want to be the people who dealt the death blow to the Pac-12, which, let's be honest, they did that when they took USC and UCLA. So it was a little silly that they were even thinking that way. But the thought, if Arizona State, and Utah were already going to go to the Big 12, which while that happened after, hours after Oregon and Washington happened, it all kind of happened all at once. And so when it became clear the Pac-12 was going to disintegrate, they were okay with taking Oregon and Washington. But I think if you look, and this is where, what Awful Announcing covers fits in here. You look at it, the initial report from Dan Wetzel last week was that they were looking at Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford. And like I said, what university president wouldn't want to be associated with Cal and Stanford? You notice Cal and Stanford dropped out of that pretty quick. And then it was just Oregon and Washington. And they only ended up taking Oregon and Washington. Why? Because Fox has outsized influence on what the Big Ten does. And Fox probably said, hey, we're fine with you taking Oregon and Washington at pennies on the dollar because we can get value out of that. I'm not so sure we get value out of Cal and Stanford.